My name is Nadia Westbrook. I am 32 years old. On the exact minute they were lowering my father into the frozen Colorado earth, I was standing on my apartment balcony 40 miles away, holding a mug of black coffee until my fingers went numb. My stepmother had banned me from the funeral. 2 days earlier, she had called me with a voice like polished ice and said it was my father's dying wish that I stay away. She said he wanted a private service for his immediate household only, and that my presence would just cause a scene. I believed her. I stayed home and cried until my ribs ached. But the part that still makes my pulse pound in my ears is not the fact that I missed his burial. It is what happened exactly 3 hours later, when my father's trusted estate attorney called me to his office and slid a thick wax-sealed envelope across his mahogany desk. I opened it and saw my father's unmistakable architectural block handwriting. The very first line read, "If you are reading this, they finally lied to you." Welcome back to Morning Revenge, where everyday people face extraordinary betrayals, and the ones pushed into the shadows finally step into the light. If you are new here, drop a comment with your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe because this story will make you question everyone you trust. I need to take you back to the morning they stole my goodbye. The air in Denver held that sharp alpine bite that settles deep in your lungs. I stood on my balcony and stared at the jagged spine of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. Somewhere up there, among the pines and the thin, quiet air, my father was being put in the ground. The silence of my apartment felt heavy. It was broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. 10:30 in the morning. The service was ending. My stepbrother Preston was probably standing at the graveside right now, straightening his expensive tie, calculating the exact moment he could stop pretending to be sad. My stepmother Sylvia would be dabbing dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting condolences from a carefully curated guest list of high society friends. They had locked me out of my own legacy. For the last 6 months of my father's life, his cognitive decline had been the perfect weapon for Sylvia. She built a fortress around the dying patriarch. She filtered his calls, managed his visitors, and slowly painted me to the rest of the family as the estranged and difficult daughter. I thought my father had simply surrendered to her narrative in his fading moments. To keep from shattering, I retreated into my work. I am a historic preservation architect. I understand structural integrity. I know how to find the load-bearing walls in a collapsing building, and I know how to spot a foundation that is rotting from the inside. I walked back into my living room, set my coffee down, and ran my fingertips over the blueprints of a 19th century mountain cabin I was restoring. The precise blue ink lines offered a comforting geometry. No messy emotions, just solid angles and strict measurements. I traced the drafted lines of a support beam and tried to convince myself that respecting his final wishes was the right thing to do. I rolled up the blueprint and slid it into a leather tube. The tears I had shed the night before were gone. They were replaced by a cold and settling numbness. I assumed the worst was over. I assumed my father had died believing I did not care enough to fight for him. I was wrong. I watched the second hand on my kitchen wall clock tick past 12 noon. Exactly 3 hours since the service began. I imagined the frozen earth being shoveled over the polished mahogany casket. I imagined the catered reception at the Denver Country Club, a venue my father had always despised. Sylvia would be holding a crystal glass of expensive Chardonnay, accepting shallow sympathy from high society friends who had never set foot on a hiking trail or dirtied their hands in the soil. I sat on my sofa, my fingers gripping the upholstery, until my knuckles turned white, listening to the crushing silence of my apartment. I felt unmoored. I am a preservation architect. My entire career is built on saving things that have been abandoned, reinforcing weak foundations, and protecting history from being demolished by careless developers. Yet I had failed to preserve my own place in my father's life. My foundation had been ripped out from under me. Then the silence shattered. My cell phone vibrated against the glass coffee table, the sudden noise making me flinch. The screen lit up with a name I had not seen in nearly 6 months, David Reed. David was not just a corporate estate attorney. He was a bulldog in a tailored suit, a man who had navigated complex Colorado land law for 40 years and had been my father's closest confidant. They had fought side by side to place hundreds of acres of alpine wilderness into protected conservation trusts. David despised Sylvia. He had once referred to my stepmother as an invasive species during a private dinner, a comment my father pretended not to hear but silently smiled at. I stared at the flashing name, my breath catching in my throat. High-powered attorneys do not call grieving daughters 3 hours after a burial unless something is catastrophically wrong. I cleared my throat, forcing down the raw ache in my vocal cords, and swiped to answer. David did not offer soft condolences. He did not ask how I was holding up or if I needed anything. His voice came through the speaker crisp-clipped and laced with an urgency that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Nadia, I need you at my office, now." I tightened my grip on the phone, rising slowly from the couch. "David," I breathed out, confused by the fierce command in his tone, "is this standard probate? Are you reading the will today?" The line went dead quiet. I could hear him breathing on the other end, a heavy, calculated sound, like a man bracing himself for an impact. When he finally spoke, his words felt like a physical blow to my chest. "No, this is about what happened this morning. Get in your car." He hung up before I could ask a single question, leaving me listening to the dead dial tone. I grabbed my keys and my heavy wool coat. Within 10 minutes, I was gripping the steering wheel of my SUV, navigating the steep, winding roads that led out of the Denver Basin and up toward the foothills where David kept his private practice. The drive forced me to navigate sharp switchbacks and narrow lanes bordered by sheer drop-offs. The rugged Colorado landscape mirrored the chaos twisting inside my mind. Tall, unyielding pines whipped past my windows. The sky above was a brilliant, blinding blue, mocking the dark confusion I was drowning in. My father loved these mountains. Thomas Westbrook was a man who measured wealth in untouched acres, clean rivers, and clear skies. He was a conservationist who believed legacy was something you protected for the next generation, not something you sold to the highest bidder. Sylvia, on the other hand, treated the wilderness like a personal insult. She complained about pine needles ruining her imported rugs and mud staining her designer boots. She viewed my father's 500-acre alpine estate as undeveloped capital, just sitting there waiting to be monetized. And then there was Preston. My stepbrother was a failing real estate developer with expensive tastes, mounting debts, and zero respect for boundaries. I pressed the accelerator, taking a sharp curve faster than I should have, the tires gripping the cold asphalt. What did David mean by what happened this morning? The funeral was supposed to be a closed-door affair. Had Sylvia done something drastic? Had Preston made a legal move on the estate before my father was even cold in the ground? The winding mountain pass offered no answers, only more sharp turns. I pulled into the small paved lot outside David's office building. It was a sturdy brick structure nestled right into the side of a rocky incline, stubborn and enduring, much like the lawyer who owned it. I killed the engine. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to sit behind the wheel for a few seconds and take a deep breath of the freezing mountain air, letting the chill shock my system into focus. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked straight past the empty receptionist's desk. When I stepped into David's private office, I was instantly hit by a wall of sensory memory. The room smelled intensely of old parchment-bound leather volumes and a faint hint of pipe tobacco. It was the exact scent of my father's home study. My breath hitched. For a split second, I felt like Thomas Westbrook was sitting right there in the leather wingback chair in the corner, waiting to ask me about my latest architectural restoration project. But it was only David. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk looking older and far more exhausted than I remembered. His tie was loosened, his suit jacket discarded over the back of a chair. He did not offer me a glass of water. He did not gesture for me to sit down. He simply stared at me with a look of intense, quiet fury. It was not directed at me. It was directed at the situation unfolding around us. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What happened, David?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "You said this was about this morning. Did Sylvia do something at the service?" David did not answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key. He leaned over, inserted the key into the heavy bottom drawer of his desk, and turned it with a loud metallic click. He reached inside and pulled out a thick envelope. He set it on the surface of the desk and slid it across the polished mahogany until it stopped mere inches from my hands. I looked down. The envelope was heavy, made of thick, cream-colored stock, but what made the blood freeze in my veins was the seal holding the flap shut, a dark crimson wax seal pressed with the distinct intertwined initials of Thomas Westbrook, my father. It was a custom stamp I had designed for him when I graduated from architectural school. He only used it for matters of absolute final importance. I stared at the wax, feeling a sudden, violent shift in the room. The narrative my stepmother had so carefully constructed over the last 2 days was cracking right in front of me. The lie that my father wanted nothing to do with me was fracturing under the weight of this single sealed document. I looked up at David. His eyes were unreadable, but his jaw was locked tight. The paralyzing grief that had trapped me in my apartment vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. I was no longer a mourning daughter excluded from a funeral. I was a woman thrust into a mystery that my father had orchestrated from his deathbed. My fingers hovered over the thick, cream-colored paper. The crimson wax seal felt cold against my skin. I did not look at David. My focus was entirely consumed by the interlocking letters stamped into the center of the wax. Thomas Westbrook. I slid my thumbnail under the flap and pushed upward. The seal cracked. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a dry branch snapping underfoot in a silent forest. I reached inside and pulled out a single folded sheet of heavy stock paper. I recognized the handwriting before my brain could even process the words. My father had spent 40 years drafting blueprints by hand. He wrote in precise architectural block lettering. The vertical lines were perfectly straight. The horizontal strokes were deliberate and measured. It was the handwriting of a man who checked every angle twice before he made a single mark. I unfolded the page. The opening sentence hit me with the force of a physical blow. If you are reading this, they finally lied to you. I stopped breathing. The mahogany walls of the law office seemed to recede into the distance. I read the line again. It was not a greeting. It was a verdict. I dragged my eyes down to the next paragraph, my heart slamming against my ribs in a chaotic, uneven rhythm. My father had written this letter 3 months ago, during a time when Sylvia told everyone his mind was unraveling, during a time when I had sat by his bedside, holding his hand, weeping, because he stared blankly at the ceiling and did not seem to know my name. His letter stripped away the illusion. My mind did not fail me, Nadia. The doctors gave me a timeline for my failing heart, but my brain stayed sharp until the very end. I needed to know what would happen to the mountain when I was gone. I needed to see who they really were when they thought the cameras were off. So I played the fading patriarch. I let Sylvia take the wheel. I let Preston roam the halls making phone calls about liquidation. I sat in my wheelchair and I watched them measure the drapes while I was still breathing. A hot tear spilled over my lower lash line, sliding down my cheek, but I did not brush it away. The profound grief that had paralyzed me all morning mutated instantly into something else. The man I loved had not been a helpless victim in his final days. He had been a scout gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. I continued reading, following the sharp ink of his penmanship. I know Sylvia banned you from the funeral. She had to. If you were present, custom dictates you would be at the house for the preliminary reading of the temporary trust. Sylvia and Preston need a 48-hour window to establish themselves as the sole grieving survivors. They need time to file paperwork claiming you abandoned the family, giving them the leverage to freeze you out of the estate entirely. The strategic brilliance of his foresight left me stunned. Sylvia had always played the grieving, devoted wife in public. She wore expensive cashmere sweaters and smiled softly at environmental charity galas, clinging to my father's arm. But behind closed doors, she viewed his lifelong conservation efforts as a tragic waste of prime real estate. Preston was even worse. My stepbrother was a man who failed at every business venture he touched. He had bankrupted a luxury condo project in Boulder and was currently drowning in debt. My father knew they were plotting to sell the protected land to commercial developers the moment his heart stopped beating. The next paragraph shifted in tone. The rigid block letters seemed to soften slightly, speaking directly to the deep bond we shared. Do you remember the summer you turned 16? We hiked the Keyhole route up Long's Peak. You wanted to quit at the boulder field. You said the rocks were too loose, too unstable. I told you that a foundation is only as strong as the stone it sits on. You cannot build a legacy on shifting gravel. Sylvia and Preston are gravel, Nadia. You are the stone. The memory washed over me, vivid and grounding. I could almost feel the thin, freezing air of the Rockies biting at my lungs. I remembered my father walking ahead of me, his heavy boots finding solid granite, refusing to let me turn back until we reached the summit. He had taught me to preserve history, to respect the natural architecture of the world, and to stand firm when the ground beneath me threatened to give way. I focused my eyes back on the page. The final section of the letter outlined his ultimate countermeasure. I knew Sylvia would try to trap you in probate. Probate is public, messy, and takes years. She has the resources to drag you through court until you run out of money and surrender. So I took the mountain off the board. 3 months ago, David helped me bypass the standard probate process. I dissolved the temporary trust. I moved the 500-acre estate, the liquid assets, and the mountain property into a blind, irrevocable land trust. I gasped the sound tearing through the quiet room. As an architect, I knew the difference between a temporary structure and a permanent fortress. An irrevocable trust could not be altered, contested, or touched by a widow's override. It was a financial vault with walls 10 feet thick. The letter concluded with the crushing reality of my new existence. You are the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary, Nadia. I left Sylvia and Preston nothing, not a single acre, not a single dime. But they do not know this yet. They think they hold all the cards. They are going to hand you a pen and demand that you sign away your rights. Let them. Let them play their hand. Let them show their true faces to the world. Wait for the perfect moment, then you drop the hammer. Build something that lasts, Nadia. Love, Dad. I lowered the heavy paper. The silence in David's office was no longer suffocating. It felt charged, humming with raw potential. My hands had stopped shaking. The cold numbness that had gripped me on my balcony was gone. In its place burned a calm, calculated focus. I looked up at David. The old lawyer was watching me with hawk-like intensity, waiting for my reaction. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. He dropped them onto the mahogany desk. They landed with a sharp, heavy clatter. "The master keys to the estate," David said, his voice low and steady. "Your father wanted you to secure the property before Sylvia and Preston returned from their morning reception." I stared at the brass keys gleaming under the warm office lighting. The narrative had just flipped. I was no longer the discarded, unwanted daughter weeping in a lonely apartment. I was the unseen architect of my family's ruin. Sylvia thought she had orchestrated the perfect crime by stealing my chance to say goodbye. She believed she had pushed me off the board. She had no idea that my father had quietly handed me the deed to the entire empire. David crossed his arms over his chest. "Sylvia and Preston are throwing a private dinner tonight at the Alpine Club to celebrate their sudden fortune. They are bringing investors. They plan to corner you, offer you a pathetic settlement, and force you to sign a quitclaim deed." I picked up the brass keys. The cold metal grounded me in the reality of the moment. My stepmother and stepbrother were rushing to liquidate a mountain they did not own. They were about to try and sell 500 acres of protected Colorado wilderness to commercial developers using forged confidence and fake tears. I tucked my father's letter into my leather bag. "We need to go to the mountain house right now," I said, my voice ringing with a new unshakable authority. "If Sylvia thinks she owns the estate, she will have left her blueprints behind, and I need to know exactly how deep of a grave she is digging for herself before I show up to dinner tonight." David offered a rare, grim smile. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. "Then let us go find the proof." My SUV climbed higher into the thin atmosphere as we left the sprawling concrete grid of Denver behind us. The air rushing through the heating vents grew noticeably colder and sharper. David sat silently in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at the winding mountain pass. Towering evergreen pines lined the steep asphalt road, acting like ancient sentinels guarding the entrance to a pristine world. This was my father's true home. Thomas Westbrook owned 500 acres of this untouched alpine wilderness. It was a massive tract of land, featuring deep valleys, crystal-clear glacial streams, and groves of centuries-old aspen trees. He spent his entire life fiercely protecting this specific ecosystem from urban sprawl and commercial development. He believed that the earth was a borrowed treasure and that our only job was to leave it exactly as we found it. Sylvia possessed a completely different philosophy. My stepmother married my father a decade ago. She was 55 years old and practically radiated a toxic disdain for the rugged, nature-loving culture of Colorado. Sylvia was a woman who only felt comfortable surrounded by marble countertops, valet parking, and exclusive country club memberships. She despised the smell of wood smoke. She hated the unpredictable mountain weather. To her, the majestic 500-acre estate was nothing more than an inconvenient bank account sitting under a pile of dirt. She viewed the majestic pine forests and sprawling meadows merely as undeveloped capital. She saw dollar signs hidden inside the timber and imagined luxury resorts paved over the natural granite. That inherent greed was never more obvious than during a specific conservation gala my father hosted on the property 5 years ago. I kept my eyes on the winding road as the memory flashed vividly in my mind. The event was a massive outdoor gathering intended to raise money for local wildlife preservation. A sudden afternoon thunderstorm had rolled through the valley, turning the manicured lawn near the Alpine Lake into a muddy swamp. Sylvia was wearing a pair of incredibly expensive designer boots. I was standing directly behind her near the catering tent when her heel sank deep into the wet earth. She ripped her foot out of the mud, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. She leaned close to her son and whispered in a venomous tone that I was never meant to hear. "This entire place is a filthy swamp. It would look so much better paved over with a luxury spa and a concrete parking garage." Her son agreed completely. Preston was 30 years old and possessed a deeply inflated sense of his own business acumen. He was a failing real estate developer with aggressively expensive tastes and rapidly mounting debts. Preston drove imported sports cars he could not afford and wore custom-tailored Italian suits to mask his financial incompetence. He had recently bankrupted a massive luxury condominium project in the city and was currently fending off lawsuits from angry investors. Preston desperately needed a golden parachute to save himself from total financial ruin. My father's pristine mountain estate was that parachute. Together, the mother and son duo had spent the last several months circling the dying patriarch like hungry vultures, waiting for a wounded lion to finally close his eyes. David broke the silence in the car, his gravelly voice pulling me back to the present moment. "You need to understand exactly what they are trying to do, Nadia. Sylvia is not just greedy. She is working with high-priced corporate lawyers. They are attempting to execute a highly obscure legal maneuver known as a spousal override." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, navigating a sharp hairpin turn. "Explain it to me," I said, my tone flat and analytical. I needed to understand the structural mechanics of their trap before I could properly dismantle it. David pulled a legal pad from his briefcase and laid it on his lap. Under certain emergency provisions in state property law, a surviving spouse can petition a judge for immediate liquidation powers over an estate if the primary heirs have officially abandoned their claim. Sylvia knows your father left the estate to you in the original will, so she manufactured your absence. The pieces clicked together in my mind with frightening clarity. They banned me from the funeral today, I realized aloud. Exactly, David confirmed. They did not exclude you out of simple malice. It was a calculated legal strategy. Sylvia needs a clean 48-hour window to file preliminary paperwork with the probate court. She is going to claim that you refused to attend the burial and that you have severed all ties with the family. If you are not present at the temporary trust reading tonight, the court will accept her filing by default. And if she gets that default judgment I prompted, feeling a cold surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. If she gets it, David continued, she gains temporary executive control over the property. She does not need permanent ownership. She only needs temporary authority to sign a binding contract. Preston has been secretly courting the Vanguard Resort Group for months. They are a massive commercial conglomerate that builds sprawling mega resorts. They want to tear down the ancient pines, blast through the granite ridges, and pour millions of tons of concrete to build chairlifts and luxury hotels. If Sylvia signs that liquidation contract tomorrow morning, Vanguard will immediately transfer $30 million into her offshore accounts. By the time you untangle the legal mess to reclaim your inheritance, the bulldozers will already be destroying the mountain. The sheer audacity of their plan left me momentarily breathless. They had weaponized my grief. They had used my respect for my father's dying wishes as a tool to steal his legacy. They thought I was a fragile, grieving daughter who would simply stay in my apartment and cry while they dismantled everything my father built. But they severely underestimated the profession I chose. I am an architect. I look at massive, imposing structures and instantly calculate their weaknesses. Sylvia and Preston had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies. They thought they had secured their wealth, but they were currently standing on the edge of a cliff, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was already crumbling. The contrast between their hollow transactional greed and the enduring authenticity of the Colorado wilderness passing outside my window was blinding. My father loved this land because it was real. It could not be bought with fake smiles or manipulated with forged documents. The mountain demanded respect. I intended to make sure Sylvia and Preston paid that respect in full. We crested the final ridge, and the massive timber and stone mountain house finally came into view. It sat perfectly integrated into the rocky hillside designed by my father to complement the landscape rather than dominate it. The sprawling driveway was completely empty. The house was dark and silent. Sylvia and Preston were still down in the city drinking vintage champagne at their exclusive country club, celebrating a victory they had not actually won. I pulled the SUV to a stop near the heavy oak front doors and shifted the transmission into park. I turned the engine off. The sudden quiet of the mountain enveloped us. We have less than 2 hours before they return to change clothes for their dinner at the Alpine Club, David warned, checking his silver wristwatch. Sylvia is arrogant. She thinks she has already won. Arrogant people leave their blueprints lying around. We just have to find them. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy brass master key my father had left for me. The metal felt warm against my palm. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the entrance. The air smelled of pine resin and impending snow. I slid the key into the heavy iron lock. I was about to walk into the belly of the beast to gather the physical evidence I needed to end them. The lock clicked loudly in the silent air. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped over the threshold. The heavy oak door swung inward on silent hinges. I stepped across the threshold and was instantly enveloped by the familiar scent of oiled cedar and cold slate. The cavernous great room stretched out before me, anchored by a towering wall of windows that framed the fading afternoon light. The sky above the jagged peaks was bruising into shades of deep violet and burnt orange. Dusk was approaching fast. We had a dangerously narrow window of time before Sylvia and Preston returned from their morning reception to change clothes for the evening dinner. David closed the door behind us, the deadbolt engaging with a definitive thud. He remained in the foyer, keeping a watchful eye on the winding driveway outside through the narrow sidelight windows. "Go," he instructed, his voice low and tight. "Find what you need. I will stand guard." I moved swiftly down the long corridor toward my father's primary study. This was the sanctuary where Thomas Westbrook had drafted conservation plans and designed eco-friendly structures for decades. I pushed open the frosted glass double doors, expecting to find the comforting, organized chaos of his genius. Instead, a wave of revulsion washed over me. The space had been systematically scrubbed. The drafting tables were swept bare. The intricate wooden architectural models that used to line the oak shelves were gone, likely thrown into trash bags and hauled away. The room felt hollowed out, devoid of the man who had breathed life into it. Sylvia had sanitized the office to make it look like a clean slate, prepping the space for the commercial real estate appraisers she intended to bring in the very next day. It was a sterile, calculated erasure of his existence. But Sylvia was not an architect. She was a socialite who only understood the surface of things. I am a preservationist. My entire career is built on reading a room by studying the joints, the load-bearing paths, and the hidden transitions where materials meet. I ignored the empty desk and began scanning the perimeter of the room, letting my professional instincts guide my eyes. People who try to hide things always disrupt the natural geometry of a space. My gaze settled on the massive river rock fireplace anchoring the far wall. Running along the bottom edge of the stonework was a thick antique oak baseboard. From a distance, it looked perfectly uniform, but as I stepped closer, the fading twilight streaming through the window illuminated a stark anomaly. A fresh, jagged gouge marred the dark wood grain. Someone had taken a metal tool, perhaps a heavy flathead screwdriver or a small pry bar, and frantically chipped away at the historic timber. I dropped to my knees on the Persian rug and ran my fingertips over the splintered wood. Sylvia. She had been searching the room and discovered the hidden panel behind the baseboard. I pushed my thumb against the damaged section of the oak, sliding the false front aside to reveal a sleek, modern digital keypad embedded in the wall. The screen was dark, locked out after too many incorrect passcodes were entered. She had tried to hack the electronic lock and failed. My father despised relying entirely on technology. He always argued that circuits fail, batteries die, and nature eventually reclaims everything wired by human hands. He never built a secure enclosure without including an analog failsafe. Only the two of us knew the secret. I ignored the dead electronic keypad entirely. Instead, I traced my fingers 18 inches to the right along the baseboard, searching for a specific natural imperfection in the wood. I found a dark, swirling knot in the oak grain. I pressed my palm flat against the knot and pushed upward with a firm sliding motion. Deep inside the wall, heavy metal tumblers shifted. A satisfying mechanical click echoed in the silent study. The hidden steel door swung outward, revealing a dark, fireproof cavity. I reached inside, my pulse thrumming a steady rhythmic beat against my throat. My fingers brushed against thick stacks of paper. I pulled out 3 heavy manila folders, secured them against my chest, and stood up. I carried the folders to the center of the room and spread the contents across the barren surface of the drafting table. I flicked on the small brass desk lamp, casting a sharp circle of yellow light over the documents. David stepped into the study, his eyes darting to the papers. "Did you find the blueprints?" he asked, stepping up beside me. I opened the first folder. It was a pristine stack of printed email correspondences. The sender was Preston. The recipient was the executive acquisition team at Vanguard Resort Group. I scanned the top page. The subject line read Final Liquidation Timeline and Alpine Clear-Cutting Protocols. My stomach tightened. Preston was not just selling the property. He was coordinating the immediate destruction of the ancient pine forests. He had mapped out exact GPS coordinates for where Vanguard should park their bulldozers the minute the sale cleared probate. The emails confirmed a $30 million payout with a $3 million advance wired to Preston's private offshore account to settle his outstanding urban development debts. I pushed the emails aside and opened the second folder. Inside rested a single, rigid document printed on state government letterhead. Environmental Waiver and Land Trust Dissolution, the title read. This was the holy grail of their scheme. To sell the protected mountain, they had to legally strip the land of its conservation status. I looked at the bottom of the page. There, sitting above the dotted line, was my father's signature. The ink was black. The strokes looked confident. To an untrained eye, it was a perfect replica. But Thomas Westbrook did not teach me how to read blueprints for nothing. I leaned in, bringing my face inches from the paper. My father drafted with a T-square for 40 consecutive years. His muscle memory was permanently locked into strict perpendicular lines. His vertical strokes never slanted. The letter T on this document leaned ever so slightly to the right. Preston is left-handed. I stared at the leaning ink, the puzzle clicking into place with cold precision. They needed me banned from the funeral to secure the 48-hour window. They needed the default probate judgment to gain temporary control of the estate. And they needed this forged waiver to hand the land over to the commercial developers before anyone could verify the paperwork. I pointed to the signature and looked at the seasoned attorney standing next to me. "This document is backdated to a week before he died," I stated, my voice calm but laced with a lethal edge. "But the vertical lines are slanted. Preston signed this." David leaned over the desk, inspecting the ink. His jaw tightened into a hard line. He exhaled a long, measured breath. "Nadia, a family dispute over a will is a civil matter, but forging a federal environmental release on a protected land trust crosses a massive legal threshold. If Preston submits this to the state authority, it is felony fraud. We need to call the authorities right now. We have the proof. Let the police arrest them at the country club." I shook my head, closing the folders and sliding them into my leather bag. No, I am not calling the police yet. If we arrest them now, Sylvia will hire a high-priced defense team, claim Preston acted alone, and drag my father's name through a public media circus for years. She will play the victim. I refuse to give her that stage. I grabbed the brass keys from the desk. Sylvia set a trap for me tonight at the Alpine Club. She is bringing her high society friends to socially pressure me into signing a quitclaim deed. She wants an audience to watch her break me, so I am going to give her one. I am going to let her present her forged documents in front of her most valuable peers. I am going to let her lock the doors of her own prison. We walked out of the study, leaving the hidden safe wide open. It was a gaping wound in the wall that Sylvia would soon discover, but by the time she realized her files were missing, I would already be sitting across from her at the dinner table. The stakes had officially escalated from a stolen inheritance to a federal crime. I walked out into the freezing mountain air, ready to build the folder that would destroy them. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat at the angled drafting table in my Denver apartment until the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in pale shades of frost and bruised purple. The 3 manila folders I had extracted from my father's hidden wall safe lay open across the wide wooden surface. I spent hours cross-referencing the slanted ink of the forged signature against dozens of my father's original architectural drafts. There was zero margin for error. Preston had hijacked a dead man's identity to authorize the destruction of 500 acres of ancient alpine forest. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated against the metal edge of my brass desk lamp. The sudden buzzing shattered the quiet concentration of the room. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-resolution contact photo of Sylvia. In the image, she was posing in Aspen, wearing an imported white fur coat, holding a glass of champagne. The woman never missed an opportunity to perform for an audience. I stared at her smiling digital face for 3 long seconds. I needed to calibrate my emotions. I could not let a single ounce of the cold, calculated fury boiling in my veins leak into my vocal cords. I took a slow, measured breath, tapped the green icon, and brought the speaker to my ear. "Nadia, sweetheart," she breathed. The tone was masterfully constructed. It dripped with a weaponized, syrupy sympathy designed to sound exactly like a grieving mother comforting a wounded child. "I know yesterday was incredibly difficult for you, Sylvia," continued, letting out a soft, rehearsed sigh. "Missing the service must have broken your heart, but your father was not himself at the end. We all had to make sacrifices to keep his passing peaceful." I pressed the pad of my thumb against the edge of the wooden drafting table until the skin turned bone white. She was actively twisting the knife. She had personally banned me from the burial, threatened to have me removed by security if I showed up, and was now framing my absence as a tragic, unavoidable consequence of my father's fading mind. She was testing the waters, checking to see if the lie had successfully broken my spirit. "But we have to be strong," Sylvia murmured, her voice lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to honor your father's practical side. He always hated lingering over unpleasant business. Preston and I are hosting a very small, intimate family dinner tonight at the Alpine Club. We just need to handle some basic estate housekeeping, a few standard signatures to release the temporary probate holds so the attorneys can do their jobs. We want you there, Nadia. It is time to heal and move forward." Before I could formulate a response, a distinct sound drifted through the receiver of the phone, the sharp crystal clink of heavy ice hitting the side of a glass tumbler. Someone was pouring a drink in the background. It was barely 8:30 in the morning, and Preston was already drinking. I could picture my stepbrother perfectly. He would be lounging in the velvet armchair of the Mountain House, wearing an Italian silk bathrobe purchased on a maxed-out credit card, swirling expensive bourbon while he drafted mental lists of the luxury cars he planned to buy. Preston was a man perpetually running from his own failures. A year ago, he had convinced a group of private investors to back a massive luxury condominium project in Boulder. He mismanaged the funds, cut corners on the structural engineering, and the entire project went bankrupt before the roof was even framed. He was currently fending off aggressive lawsuits and dodging phone calls from very angry creditors. Preston desperately needed liquid cash to save himself from prison. He was celebrating a $30 million payout from the Vanguard Resort Group that he did not actually possess yet. I closed my eyes and mapped out the architecture of Sylvia's trap. The Alpine Club was not a casual dining establishment. It was an ultra-exclusive wood-paneled institution located in the wealthiest district of downtown Denver. It reeked of old money political connections and quiet, unyielding arrogance. You could not get a reservation without a six-figure membership and a sponsor. Sylvia chose that specific location on purpose. It was a hostile environment wrapped in velvet upholstery. The tactic was a classic maneuver in predatory negotiations. You isolate the target in a highly public, extremely prestigious setting where causing a scene would be socially disastrous. You surround them with intimidating wealth, apply overwhelming emotional pressure, and slide a complicated legal document across the tablecloth. You force the signature before the victim has time to process the fine print or call legal counsel. Sylvia had used this exact strategy years ago to strong-arm my father into funding a fraudulent charity run by one of her high society friends. She cornered him at a crowded gala, forcing him to write a check to avoid a public argument. She was running the exact same play on me. She was counting on my grief to blind me. She expected me to be a fragile, emotionally shattered daughter desperate for any scrap of familial inclusion. She wanted to hand me a pen, watch me sign away my entire inheritance, and then validate my compliance by buying me an expensive steak. I kept my voice perfectly flat, dropping my pitch to mimic the hollow exhaustion of a defeated woman. Tonight, I murmured, letting a subtle, manufactured tremor slip into the single word. I suppose I can make it. What time should I arrive? 7 o'clock sharp, dear, Sylvia replied quickly. The syrupy thickness in her voice instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp edge of victorious relief. She thought the fish had firmly taken the bait. She thought the hook was set. Dress nicely, she added, a hint of her usual condescension creeping back into her tone. We reserved the private dining room on the second floor. Oh, and Nadia, do not bother bringing David Reed or any other lawyer. This is just family taking care of family. We are going to wipe the slate clean tonight. I will see you at 7, Sylvia, I said softly. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I set the device down on the drafting table and stared at the dark screen. The sheer audacity of her scheme was breathtaking. She was attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar wilderness trust using the cover of a healing family dinner. She believed she held the executioner's axe. She had no idea she was actively walking into a high-speed buzzsaw. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The exhaustion of staying awake all night vanished, burned away by a cold, searing adrenaline. Sylvia wanted a standard signature. She wanted to release the temporary holds. She was planning to hand me a quitclaim deed, a legal document that would permanently sever my rights to contest the probate, allowing her to finalize the sale to the resort conglomerate by morning. I walked over to the large bay window and looked out at the Denver skyline. The glass and steel skyscrapers reflected the morning sun, but my eyes bypassed the city entirely. I focused on the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the land my father bled for, the land they were trying to pave over with concrete chairlifts and luxury spas. I turned back to the drafting table. I gathered the printed emails, the backdated environmental waiver, and the forensic comparisons of the slanted signature. I placed them meticulously inside a thick, heavy-duty leather folder. I was not going to walk into the Alpine Club as a grieving victim. I was going to walk into that private dining room as the primary architect of their destruction. But before I stepped into the lion's den, I needed to make sure my legal weapon was armed and ready to fire. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter. I needed to see David Reed one more time. I navigated my vehicle back through the winding roads toward David Reed's law firm. The sky above the Colorado foothills had shifted into a bruised shade of slate gray. Heavy, dense winter clouds were gathering over the jagged peaks, signaling an impending storm. The temperature outside was plummeting, matching the frigid clarity sharpening inside my mind. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. Every rotation of the tires brought me closer to executing a strategy that would permanently alter the trajectory of my family. When I pulled into the small parking lot, the asphalt was already dusted with a fine layer of snow. I grabbed my heavy leather portfolio and pushed through the glass doors of the brick building. The receptionist waved me through without a word, recognizing the focused intensity radiating from my posture. I stepped into David's private office. He was standing by his wide window, holding a ceramic mug of dark coffee, watching the snowfall. He turned around when he heard the door click shut. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a man who had spent 4 decades fighting corporate greed only to see it infect his best friend's household. "I told you they were arrogant," I stated quietly, walking straight to his glass conference table. The heavy leather folder slapped against the polished surface with a definitive thud. I unzipped the main compartment and began dealing the documents out like a dealer presenting a losing hand. I laid down the printed emails detailing the $30 million resort transaction. Next, I extracted the final, most damning piece of their puzzle. I placed the rigid, state-issued environmental waiver directly in the center of the glass table. David set his coffee down and stepped closer. He retrieved his wire-rimmed reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his face. He leaned over the table, his eyes tracking the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. His jaw muscles clenched tight. "An environmental release," he murmured, his voice laced with deep disgust. He tapped his pristine index finger against the top header. "This is the silver bullet for the resort developers. It strips the entire 500-acre estate of all conservation protections, rezoning the pristine wilderness for commercial excavation." He slid his finger down to the bottom margin, resting right above the dark ink signature. "State property law mandates this specific document must be executed by the primary estate holder. The date stamped next to the signature is exactly 7 days before your father passed away." David looked up at me, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Sylvia assumes she is the sole beneficiary through her marriage, but she knows a probate judge might freeze the assets if there is a dispute or a financial audit. By backdating this waiver, they ensure the land is legally cleared for commercial zoning before the estate even enters formal probate proceedings. It is a staggering level of manipulation." "Look closer at the signature, David," I instructed. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a protective cardboard tube. Inside was an original, hand-drawn blueprint. It was a structural draft for a timber frame visitor center my father had designed over a decade ago. I unrolled the thick vellum sheet and placed it right next to the fraudulent state waiver. The smell of aged paper and graphite filled the space between us. "My father was an old-school preservationist," I explained, smoothing the corners of the blueprint flat against the glass. "He spent 4 decades drafting on slanted tables, using physical instruments." I pointed to the handwritten title block on the bottom right corner of the vellum. "Notice the vertical lines. Look closely at the letter T in his first name. He drafted with a physical T-square every single day of his professional life. His muscle memory was permanently locked into strict 90-degree perpendicular angles. A man with that kind of ingrained physical discipline does not suddenly change the geometry of his handwriting, even when his health is failing." I shifted my index finger back to the state waiver. "Now look at the signature on this release document. The ink is heavy, clearly trying to mimic his confident, forceful stroke. But study the letter T. It leans. It slants a few degrees to the right." David leaned closer, squinting through his lenses at the dark ink. "The slant is consistent throughout the entire signature." I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "Preston is left-handed. He holds his pen at an awkward hooked angle. I remember watching him sign a lease for a sports car he could not afford 3 years ago. He smeared the ink on the contract because his palm dragged across the page from the left side. Sylvia did not forge this document. Her desperate, debt-ridden son did." David straightened his posture, pulling his glasses off and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The true gravity of the situation settled over the room like a heavy iron weight. The air felt thin. "Nadia," he said, his tone shifting from an advisory lawyer to a stern guardian, "a greedy stepmother trying to strong-arm you into accepting a bad financial settlement is a civil dispute. We fight those battles in probate court, but forging the signature of a deceased man on a federal environmental release document in order to execute a $30 million real estate transaction elevates this entirely." He paused, letting the reality sink in. "This is felony fraud. It constitutes wire fraud, identity theft, and severe criminal conspiracy." He reached across his desk toward the heavy black telephone. We are calling the district attorney right now. I have connections in the prosecutor's office. The state police can meet Sylvia and Preston at the Alpine Club tonight and place them both in handcuffs before the waiter even pours their wine. I reached across the glass table and pressed my hand firmly down on the receiver, stopping him from lifting the handset. "No," I said, locking eyes with the seasoned attorney. "Put the phone down." David looked at me genuinely bewildered, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "We have the physical proof, Nadia. We have the motive, the emails, and the forged document. Why on earth would we wait? Because if you arrest them right now, Sylvia will hire a team of elite defense attorneys by midnight," I explained, keeping my vocal cords devoid of any panic. "She will claim Preston acted entirely on his own. She will say she had zero knowledge the document was forged. She will play the devastated, grieving widow who was betrayed by her own greedy son. She will drag my father's legacy through a highly publicized media circus for years, painting herself as a tragic victim." I removed my hand from the phone and tapped the leather folder containing the evidence. I refuse to give her that narrative. I refuse to let her hide behind plausible deniability. I want them to commit to their lie in front of an audience they highly respect. I want Sylvia to present this forged document to me herself in a public setting, surrounded by her high society friends. I want to watch her lock the doors of her own prison. David stared at me for a long moment. He slowly realized that the weeping daughter he had summoned yesterday was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to dismantle a criminal enterprise using nothing but patience and precise timing. A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. "What do you need me to do?" he finally asked, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I need you to wait," I replied, zipping the leather portfolio shut. "Drive to the Alpine Club tonight. Park your car directly outside the main entrance. Do not come inside the restaurant until I send you a specific text message. When you receive my signal, you walk into that private dining room and bring the actual irrevocable land trust documents with you. We are going to let them build their house of cards as high as possible. Then we are going to kick the table." I drove back to my downtown apartment as the afternoon shadows stretched long and thin across the pavement. The frantic energy that had gripped me the day before was entirely gone. Grief often manifests as a wild, unpredictable storm tearing through your mind and leaving nothing but debris. Anger, when properly harnessed, acts as a different element altogether. It transforms into cold, hardened steel. As I rode the elevator up to my floor, I felt no urge to scream or throw objects against the drywall. I possessed the sharp, singular focus of a structural engineer preparing to dismantle a condemned high-rise. You do not bring down a towering edifice by swinging a sledgehammer blindly at the foundation. You study the schematics, locate the load-bearing pillars, and place the explosive charges with exact, calculated precision. My stepmother and stepbrother had spent months constructing a towering monument to their own vanity and greed. Tonight, I plan to sever their support columns and watch the roof cave in. I walked into my living room and cleared everything off my drafting table. The sketches, the graphite pencils, the metal measuring tapes, I swept them all into a drawer. I required a pristine, uncluttered surface to organize my retribution. I unzipped my leather satchel and laid the gathered evidence out under the bright, focused glow of my brass desk lamp. I moved with slow, deliberate intention, treating the documents like highly volatile materials. First, I placed the printed email chains on the left side of the wooden board. The digital correspondence between Preston and the Vanguard Resort Group painted a damning picture. The words on the printed pages outlined the precise GPS coordinates for the proposed concrete foundations, the heavy machinery logistics, and the wire transfer instructions for the $30 million payout. Next to the emails, I set down the liquidation contracts, the preliminary agreements my stepbrother had drafted to secure his offshore financial advance. Then came the centerpiece of their fraud. I smoothed the backdated environmental waiver flat against the wood grain. The forged ink stared back at me, the slanted letter serving as a permanent monument to Preston's hubris. Beside it, I aligned the forensic signature analysis I had compiled, placing my father's original architectural blueprint directly adjacent for undeniable visual comparison. The discrepancy was stark, irrefutable, and lethal in a court of law. Finally, I drew the true foundation of my defense from the bottom of my bag, the original irrevocable land trust documents David had drawn up 3 months ago. The thick stack of legal parchment bore my father's authentic perpendicular signature, naming me the sole trustee and exclusive beneficiary of the vast 500-acre estate. I opened a heavy-duty matte black presentation folder. I began arranging the pages inside, sequencing them not just chronologically, but narratively. I was building a trap door. Page 1 would hook their attention and validate their false sense of security. Page 2 would spring the hidden latch. Page 3 would drop the floor out from under their feet. I tapped the edges of the paper against the table, aligning them perfectly, and clipped them securely into the binding. The physical weight of the dossier felt substantial in my hands. It held no lingering sorrow, only undeniable, verifiable truth. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting the city in twilight. I walked into my kitchen and pulled a bag of dark roast coffee beans from the upper cabinet. My father despised complicated espresso machines and sweet syrups. He preferred his coffee brewed strong, black, and bitter. I fed the beans into the grinder, listening to the harsh rattling noise fill the quiet apartment. The rich, earthy aroma bloomed in the air, instantly transporting me back to crisp mornings at the mountain estate, sitting on the wooden deck while the fog rolled off the glacial lake. I poured the steaming liquid into a thick ceramic mug and carried it to the living room window. I stood by the glass, letting the heat seep into my cold palms. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains loomed like ancient silhouettes against the darkening sky. They looked unyielding, permanent, untouchable. I took a slow sip of the bitter brew and closed my eyes, letting a specific memory wash over my consciousness. I was 20 years old, frustrated over a stalled restoration project, complaining that progress was taking too long and the materials were resisting my efforts. My father had placed his calloused hand on my shoulder, pointed toward those very peaks, and spoken in a low, resonant baritone. "Mountains do not rush, Nadia. They just outlast the weather. Storms batter the granite, snow freezes the ridges, and wind tries to strip the soil. But when the sky finally clears, the mountain is always still standing." Sylvia and Preston were just weather. They were a temporary, noisy storm of deception and greed making a mess, but lacking any true structural permanence. I opened my eyes, staring at the distant peaks until they vanished into the night. I did not need to shout panic or rush the confrontation. I only needed to stand my ground and outlast them. I set the empty mug in the stainless steel sink and walked into my bedroom to prepare for the evening. The invitation dictated proper attire for the exclusive dining club. Normally, I would choose a soft knit sweater or an understated dress blending into the background, but tonight required a different skin. I reached into the back of my closet and pulled out a tailored dark charcoal blazer and matching trousers. The fabric was stiff-structured and immaculate. I slipped the jacket on, feeling the sharp lines of the shoulders instantly square my posture. I fastened the dark buttons, treating the garment less like clothing and more like tactical armor. I tied my hair back into a tight, practical knot at the nape of my neck, removing any stray strands that might soften my face. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable from the weeping daughter who had stood on a balcony mere hours ago. The grief was securely locked away inside a vault, replaced by a cold, impenetrable resolve. I was no longer an excluded child begging for a seat at the table. I was the legally appointed executor of a wilderness empire, stepping out to eradicate a parasite. I returned to the living room, picked up the matte black folder, and slid it into my leather briefcase. The brass clasps snapped shut with a sharp, definitive click. The silence in the apartment broke as the wall clock chimed 6:30. The waiting was over. The preparation was complete. I grabbed my car keys, stepped out into the hallway, and locked my door. The storm was about to hit, and I was bringing the lightning. I surrendered my vehicle to the valet outside the Alpine Club, stepping onto the pristine concrete sidewalk. Downtown Denver hummed with evening activity, but this particular establishment existed inside its own insulated bubble of extreme, untouchable wealth. The exterior was understated, marked only by a small brass plaque next to heavy mahogany double doors. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. The air smelled of roasted bone marrow, aged bourbon, and unearned arrogance. Dimly lit sconces cast warm shadows over the dark wood-paneled walls. A low, sophisticated murmur of jazz music played from hidden speakers. This was not a place where people came to mourn a lost loved one. This was a place where lucrative deals were struck over $1,000 bottles of imported wine. My father had always despised this restaurant, calling it a sterile monument to empty vanity. It was the perfect setting for my stepmother. I bypassed the crowded main dining floor. The sharply dressed maitre d' gave my tailored charcoal blazer a quick assessing glance before pointing me toward the grand staircase. The private dining suites were located on the second floor, designed specifically for discreet corporate takeovers and wealthy family squabbles. My leather briefcase felt substantial in my grip, anchoring me to the reality of my mission. I climbed the thick carpeted steps, listening to the ambient noise of the restaurant fade away with every upward stride. I channeled the mindset of an architect walking onto a chaotic construction site. I needed to ignore the noise, focus on the structural supports, and find the exact pressure points required to bring the edifice down. At the end of the long, silent hallway stood a solid oak door adorned with a brass nameplate reading The Elk Room. I did not bother knocking. I gripped the cool metal handle, turned it firmly, and pushed the door inward. The private dining space was opulent, dominated by a long rectangular table set with crystal goblets, starched white napkins, and polished silver flatware. A low-hanging chandelier cast a bright, focused pool of light directly onto the center of the table, leaving the edges of the room cloaked in shadow. Sylvia sat exactly where I expected her to sit, claiming the head of the table like a monarch surveying her newly conquered territory. She wore a sleek black velvet dress, a garment that theoretically signaled mourning, but was cut far too low to be considered respectful for a widow. Around her neck hung a flashy multi-carat diamond necklace. The gems caught the light from the chandelier, throwing brilliant shards of reflection across the dark wood paneling. It was a grotesque display of premature victory. She was broadcasting her assumed inheritance to the room before the ink on her forged documents was even dry. To her right sat Preston. My stepbrother was feverishly tapping the screen of his smartphone, his leg bouncing nervously under the tablecloth. A thin sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead. He was likely checking his banking application, waiting for the $30 million resort payout from Vanguard to miraculously appear. He looked less like a grieving son and more like a desperate gambler waiting for the final card to drop. But they were not alone. Seated along the flanks of the table were two older women draped in expensive silk blouses and heavy, suffocating floral perfume. I recognized them immediately as Constance and Victoria. They were Sylvia's most trusted high society peers, women who spent their days organizing lavish charity luncheons and gossiping about country club scandals. I identified the tactic the moment I saw their perfectly manicured faces. Sylvia had brought an audience. She intended to use her friends as social enforcers. They were seated there to nod sympathetically, apply crushing peer pressure, and make me feel outnumbered. If I dared to cause a scene, I would be branded an unstable, ungrateful child in front of the city's most elite whisper network. If I wept, I would be deemed too fragile to handle the estate. The only acceptable outcome in their minds was for me to quietly sign whatever paper was placed in front of me and accept their shallow condolences. The low murmur of their conversation died instantly the second my shoes stepped onto the thick carpet. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance. The silence in the private room turned dense, thick, and suffocating. Sylvia recovered first. She pasted a look of profound, agonizing sympathy across her face, a masterclass in theatrical sorrow. She pushed her heavy wooden chair back and stood up, extending her arms wide as if she intended to wrap me in a warm maternal embrace. "Nadia, sweetheart," Sylvia cooed, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls with a cloying sweetness. "I am so relieved you found the strength to join us tonight. We have been so terribly worried about you." She took 2 steps toward me, her arms still outstretched, waiting for me to step into the trap. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my posture rigidly straight and fixed my gaze directly on her diamond necklace. The sheer absurdity of her performance was staggering. She had banned me from my own father's burial mere hours ago, utilizing my profound grief as a weapon to secure her default probate judgment. Now she was attempting to play the role of the benevolent, comforting guardian in front of her socialite audience. I did not offer a polite smile. I did not return her syrupy greeting. I simply broke eye contact, stepped around her outstretched arms, and walked the entire length of the room. I bypassed the empty chair situated right next to Preston deliberately, refusing to sit in their designated interrogation zone. Instead, I pulled out the heavy mahogany chair at the exact opposite end of the long rectangular table. By claiming the foot of the table, I positioned myself directly across from Sylvia. I mirrored her placement. I was not a subordinate guest joining her dinner party. I was an opposing force establishing a clear, undeniable boundary. I occupied this space with intentional authority, silently communicating that I was not there to be managed. I sat down. I lifted my leather briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of the crisp white tablecloth. The brass clasps clinked sharply against a fine china bread plate, a harsh metallic sound that shattered the remaining tension in the room. Sylvia was left standing awkwardly near the door, her arms slowly dropping to her sides as the performative hug dissolved into thin air. Constance and Victoria exchanged rapid, wide-eyed glances, their social programming short-circuiting in the face of my blatant refusal to play along. Preston finally looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing in deep irritation, annoyed that the transaction was not going smoothly. Sylvia cleared her throat, a harsh sound masking her sudden embarrassment. She hurried back to her seat at the head of the table. She smoothed her velvet dress, adjusted her diamond necklace, and offered a tight, brittle smile to her friends before turning her attention back to me. "Now, Nadia," she began her tone, adopting a gentle, patronizing cadence designed to make me feel small. "I know emotions are running incredibly high today. This is a hard process for everyone. The waiter will be here shortly with the reserve wine list. We can order some light appetizers, share some fond memories, and just relax before we discuss the boring paperwork." I rested my hands flat on top of my leather briefcase. I stared directly down the length of the table, locking my eyes onto Sylvia's perfectly contoured face. "Let us skip the appetizers, Sylvia," I said. My voice was calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of warmth. It cut through the heavy air of the dining room like a scalpel. "Why am I here?" The electric tension in the room spiked. Constance let out a soft, scandalized gasp, clutching her linen napkin. Preston clenched his jaw, sliding his phone face down onto the table. Sylvia's brittle smile faltered, the corners of her mouth twitching downward as she realized the obedient, grieving daughter she had summoned was not the woman sitting across from her. The trap they had so carefully constructed was indeed closing, but the predators sitting at the table were oblivious to the fact that they were the ones caught inside it. Sylvia stared at me from the opposite end of the long mahogany table. The brittle, performative smile she had plastered across her face dissolved, replaced by a calculated expression of profound sorrow. She was a seasoned socialite, highly trained in the art of manipulating an audience. Instead of answering my blunt question directly, she turned her head slightly to the side, ensuring her high society friends Constance and Victoria had a clear view of her tragic profile. She pressed a manicured hand over her collarbone, right above the flashing diamond necklace she had worn to celebrate her incoming wealth. "Nadia, we know how deeply you are hurting right now," Sylvia began her pitch, dropping into a soft, breathy cadence. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Constance to lean forward and offer a sympathetic nod. The entire display was choreographed. "Your father was a proud man," Sylvia continued, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "But you have to admit, his mind was so clouded at the end. The doctors warned us this would happen. The dementia made him paranoid. He pushed everyone away. He pushed me away. And I know it breaks your heart to hear this, but he especially pushed you away. He did not want you at the house. He could not bear the stress of your visits." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on top of my leather briefcase. I did not break eye contact. The psychological warfare she was deploying was textbook gaslighting. She was attempting to rewrite history in real time. She wanted to convince me that the man who had taught me how to scale a mountain and draft a structural blueprint had died, viewing me as an unbearable burden. If I had not driven to David Reed's office that morning, if I had not broken the wax seal on my father's handwritten letter, her words would have devastated me. I would have crumbled right there in the private dining room, weeping into my hands, believing my father had faded into the dark without a shred of love left for his only daughter. But I possessed the letter. I knew the truth. My father had played the fading patriarch specifically to test her character, and she had failed spectacularly. Knowing this granted me an impenetrable shield. I watched her spin her web of lies with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a parasite through a microscope. Preston and I did everything we could to make his final days comfortable, Sylvia whispered, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. But Thomas left a terrible mess behind, a tragic, complicated mess. Preston and I are just trying to clean it up so this family can finally heal. She gestured toward her son passing the baton. Preston took his cue seamlessly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. He projected the aura of a seasoned corporate executive, a role he desperately wanted to play but never actually earned. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal paper, bound by a heavy blue clip. He slid the document across the polished mahogany. The thick paper made a dry scraping sound as it traveled the length of the table, coming to a halt just inches from my briefcase. Preston reached into his breast pocket again. He pulled out a pen. My breath caught in my throat, though I forced my facial expression to remain entirely neutral. It was a heavy silver Montblanc fountain pen. I recognized the subtle dent on the metal cap. I had purchased that specific pen for my father 5 years ago to celebrate the anniversary of his wildlife conservation trust. He kept it displayed on his primary drafting table, refusing to use it for anything other than signing final architectural blueprints. Preston had not just raided the study to forge the environmental waiver. He had pilfered my father's personal belongings, treating his legacy like a garage sale. Preston tapped the silver cap of the stolen Mont Blanc against the top page of the document. "It is just a standard quitclaim deed," Nadia Preston said smoothly. His voice carried the practiced rhythmic cadence of a salesman pitching a timeshare. He tapped the pen again, indicating the signature line at the bottom of the page. "It simply waives your right to contest the probate process. I know you were hoping for a large inheritance, but the reality is bleak. Dad left the estate underwater. He took out multiple secondary mortgages to fund his ridiculous environmental charities, and the property taxes have been in arrears for years. The banks are preparing to foreclose on the mountain house by the end of the month." The lies flowed from his mouth like polluted water. My father despised debt. The 500-acre estate was owned free and clear, paid off decades ago. There were no secondary mortgages, there were no tax liens. Preston was projecting his own catastrophic financial failures onto my father, using his own impending bankruptcy as a fictional narrative to scare me into compliance. "If this goes to probate court," Preston continued, leaning closer, attempting to dominate my field of vision, "the creditors will drag all of us through years of litigation. You will be held liable for his outstanding debts as his biological daughter. We are doing you a favor by taking this burden off your hands. My mother is willing to absorb the financial hit to protect your future." Preston reached into his jacket one final time. He produced a sleek leather checkbook. He flipped it open, unclicked the stolen Mont Blanc pen, and hastily scribbled a sequence of numbers across a blank check. He tore the small slip of paper from the binding and tossed it onto the center of the quitclaim deed. "Just sign the release," Nadia Preston instructed, flashing a tight, patronizing smile. "We will cut you this check for 50 grand tonight. Consider it an early exit bonus. It is enough cash to help you get on your feet, pay off your student loans, and start fresh, without carrying Dad's financial failures on your shoulders." I looked down at the slip of paper. $50,000. I calculated the math in my head. Vanguard Resort Group was preparing to wire Preston $30 million the moment the land was legally cleared for commercial excavation. My stepbrother was offering me a fraction of a percent of my own inheritance, framing it as a generous act of familial charity. It was the ultimate insult. They viewed me as an uneducated peasant begging for table scraps, hoping I would be too blinded by grief and a quick payday to read the fine print on their fraudulent contract. Constance and Victoria murmured their approval from the sidelines. Victoria took a delicate sip of her ice water, nodding at Sylvia with a look of deep admiration. They were thoroughly convinced by the performance. In their eyes, Sylvia and Preston were the noble saviors sacrificing their own financial security to rescue a troubled, estranged daughter from certain ruin. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not touch the $50,000 check. I did not even look at the quitclaim deed. I simply stared at the dent on the cap of the Mont Blanc. Silence is a tool. In architectural engineering, you test the structural integrity of a load-bearing beam by applying sustained silent pressure. If the foundation is weak, the silence forces the hidden cracks to expand. Human psychology operates on the exact same principle. Manipulators rely on momentum. They need their victim to react, argue, cry, or protest. When you deny them a reaction, their carefully constructed narrative loses all its forward energy. The vacuum of silence forces them to confront their own anxiety. I let the seconds tick by. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. The ambient noise of the jazz music playing outside the private suite seemed to fade away. The only sound in the Elk Room was the low hum of the chandelier bulbs overhead. The tension in the air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on the occupants of the table. Preston shifted his weight, his left leg resuming its nervous bouncing under the table. His confident salesman smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. He looked at his mother, seeking reassurance. Sylvia adjusted her posture. The silence was unnerving her. She hated losing control of a room, especially with her wealthy peers watching. She crossed her legs, uncrossed them, and reached for her crystal wine glass. Her fingers trembled slightly against the stem. She cleared her throat, breaking the heavy quiet. The heavy silence stretched until it threatened to snap. I kept my gaze locked on the silver Mont Blanc pen resting atop the stack of legal paper. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the sharp, resonant clarity of a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. A standard quitclaim, I repeated softly. I let the phrase hang in the air, leaving the silver pen untouched on the pristine tablecloth. I shifted my eyes away from the documents and looked around the dining room. I made sure to establish direct, deliberate eye contact with Constance and then Victoria. I wanted Sylvia's high society friends to pay very close attention to the exact words being exchanged. I needed them to serve as sworn witnesses to the impending structural collapse of my stepmother's narrative. To take the debt off my hands, I continued returning my focus to my stepbrother. I tilted my head slightly, studying his rigid posture. That is very generous of you, Preston, offering me $50,000 out of your own pocket to save me from financial ruin. It is incredibly selfless. My tone was perfectly smooth, devoid of any obvious sarcasm. To Constance and Victoria, my response probably sounded like the genuine, humbled gratitude of a defeated daughter. But Preston possessed the sharp, paranoid instincts of a cornered animal. He heard the faint, icy undertone beneath my words. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His right hand twitched, drifting instinctively toward his crystal water goblet. Sylvia sensed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The seasoned socialite recognized that the momentum of the conversation was stalling. She needed to push the transaction across the finish line before I had time to process any lingering doubts. Her smile tightened the edges of her lips, pulling taut against her teeth. "Family helps family," dear Sylvia chimed in, her voice adopting a brisk, businesslike efficiency. "That is what your father would have wanted. We are here to protect you. Now just sign the bottom line next to the red tab. There is a licensed notary waiting for us in the lobby downstairs. We can have this entire ugly ordeal finalized tonight, and you can walk away with a clean slate." She gestured toward the stolen fountain pen, her manicured fingernails tapping impatiently against the polished mahogany table. She was rushing the close. It was the desperate, reckless maneuver of a grifter who knows their mark is dangerously close to seeing through the illusion. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I leaned back in my heavy wooden chair. The physical movement was slight, but the psychological implications were profound. By leaning away from the documents, I visually rejected her urgency. I removed myself from the pressure zone she had so carefully constructed. I rested my palms flat against the leather surface of my closed briefcase. "I am curious, Sylvia," I said, allowing the manufactured softness to bleed entirely out of my vocal cords. My natural authoritative register returned, filling the quiet private suite. If the estate is truly underwater, I continued, measuring every syllable with deliberate precision, if my father left behind nothing but crushing secondary mortgages and tax liens, why were you celebrating with vintage champagne last night? The question landed on the table like a lead weight. Sylvia blinked, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowing in genuine confusion. The swift change in subject threw her off balance. I watched her brain scramble to process the inquiry. I beg your pardon? Sylvia stammered, her voice losing its syrupy coating. What are you talking about? I visited the Mountain House last night, I stated calmly. I noticed 2 empty bottles of 1998 Dom Perignon sitting in the kitchen recycling bin. 2 crystal flutes were resting on the granite counter. It seems like a rather lavish celebration for a widow drowning in her late husband's insurmountable debt. The color began to drain from Sylvia's face, starting at her cheeks and seeping downward. The realization that I had bypassed her security and entered the pristine Alpine estate without her knowledge hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some fabricated excuse, but I did not give her the oxygen to form a lie. And while we are discussing the Mountain House, I pressed forward, shifting my gaze directly to my stepbrother. Why is Preston exchanging highly detailed emails with the executive acquisition team at the Vanguard Resort Group? Preston froze. His right hand was hovering halfway across the table, reaching for his crystal water glass. His fingers locked in midair. His entire body went rigidly still, paralyzed by the sudden, violent exposure of his hidden agenda. I did not raise my voice, but the intensity of my words commanded the entire room. Why is he discussing liquidating 500 acres of protected alpine meadow? Preston, why are you mapping out GPS coordinates for concrete foundations and commercial chairlifts on land that my father specifically placed under an environmental conservation hold? The silence that followed was suffocating. The ambient jazz music playing in the distant hallway seemed to vanish entirely. Preston's hand began to shake. The tremor traveled up his arm, radiating into his shoulder. His fingers bumped the edge of the crystal goblet. The heavy glass tipped, spilling ice water across the pristine white tablecloth. The dark stain spread rapidly, soaking into the fabric, but Preston did not even notice. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He looked exactly like a thief caught with his hands buried deep inside a vault. The syrupy, benevolent facade Sylvia had worn all evening instantly shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The rich, flushed tone of her skin turned a sickly ashen gray. She gripped the arms of her mahogany chair so tightly, her knuckles protruded against the skin. I do not know what you are talking about, Sylvia gasped, her voice shrill and trembling. Her poised high society persona collapsed under the sheer weight of the accusation. Those are lies. You are making this up. Her eyes darted frantically to the right and left, seeking refuge in the faces of her chosen audience, but she found no comfort there. Constance had recoiled in her seat, clutching her pearl necklace, her eyes darting between the spilled water and Sylvia's pale face. Victoria sat frozen, her lips parted in shock. The socialites were highly attuned to the subtle shifts in power dynamics. They could read the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from Sylvia and Preston. They suddenly realized they had not been invited to witness a generous act of familial charity. They had been brought in to facilitate a shakedown. The escalation hit its absolute peak. I had not unclasped my leather briefcase. I had not presented a single piece of physical evidence. I had not laid down the printed emails, the backdated state waiver, or the forensic signature analysis. I had simply fired 2 precise, factual questions across the dining table. The sheer accuracy of the strike dismantled their carefully constructed narrative in less than 60 seconds. The power dynamic in the elk room inverted with staggering speed. The hunters suddenly realized they had wandered blindly into a cage. They were no longer the predators circling a wounded target. They were the prey pinned under the bright, unforgiving light of the chandelier, waiting for the final blow to fall. I looked at the $50,000 check resting on top of the quitclaim deed. Then I looked back at Sylvia. You brought me here to sign away an estate you do not own, I said, my voice ringing with cold authority. You tried to buy my birthright with pennies stolen from a $30 million payout. Did you really think I would not inspect the foundation before I signed the contract? Sylvia opened her mouth and her jaw working soundlessly. The devastating reality of her situation was finally breaching the walls of her arrogance. She was trapped in a room with the one person she had underestimated, and the exit doors were rapidly closing. The dense atmosphere inside the Elk Room felt akin to the moments preceding a massive seismic event. The air grew stifling, charged with an invisible electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand at attention. Sylvia sat frozen at the head of the table, her fabricated reality collapsing under the weight of my factual inquiries. I did not grant her a single moment to catch her breath or formulate a new deception. The time for asking questions had officially concluded. The time for presenting the verdict had arrived. I shifted my attention downward to the matte black presentation folder resting inside my open leather briefcase. My fingers grazed the smooth edge of the heavy stock paper. I bypassed the printed emails and the backdated environmental waiver for the moment. Those documents represented the lethal strike. I needed to deliver the emotional, devastating blow first. I gripped the crisp edge of the thick, cream-colored parchment and pulled it into the bright light of the chandelier. "Dad told me you would say that," I stated, my voice echoing with a calm, unwavering certainty. Sylvia blinked her gaze, tracking the movement of the paper in my hand. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the mahogany table, the knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. "He anticipated every single lie you would construct," I continued, keeping my tone leveled and precise. "He knew you would attempt to isolate me, ban me from the burial, and paint me as an ungrateful villain to your wealthy social circle. He understood your playbook perfectly, so he left me a final message to ensure your narrative would never take root." I held the folded parchment up, allowing the warm, ambient light to illuminate the dark, crimson wax seal broken along the edge. "Would you like to hear the first line?" I asked. I did not wait for her permission. I did not pause for Preston to interject. I unfolded the heavy paper, letting my eyes scan the familiar, comforting geometry of my father's handwriting. I read the words aloud, projecting my voice so every syllable resonated against the dark wood paneling of the private suite. "If you are reading this, they finally lied to you." The sentence dropped into the center of the room like a granite boulder plummeting into a still pond. The impact was visceral. Constance let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, pressing her silk napkin against her mouth. Victoria shrank backward into her upholstered chair, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit door. I reached into my briefcase a second time, retrieving a high-quality replica I had printed that afternoon. I placed the replica flat against the pristine white tablecloth. With a swift, deliberate push of my fingertips, I sent the paper gliding down the center of the long table. It slid past the silver flatware and the spilled ice water, coming to a smooth halt directly in front of Sylvia. She looked down at the document. The color draining from her face accelerated, leaving her skin an unhealthy, chalky hue. Even upside down, the rigid vertical strokes of the architectural block lettering were unmistakable. My father had a distinct, commanding penmanship that could never be replicated by a casual forger. Sylvia recognized the handwriting instantly. It was a voice speaking to her from beyond the grave, stripping away her carefully maintained facade of the grieving widow. Her mouth opened, forming a small, silent circle. She attempted to draw a breath, but her lungs seemed incapable of expanding. She closed her mouth, swallowed hard, and opened it again. No words emerged. She resembled a diver who had suddenly lost their oxygen supply, suffocating under the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. "He knew, Sylvia," I said, leaning forward slightly, claiming the physical space between us. I kept my eyes locked onto hers, refusing to let her look away from the reality of her own failure. "He knew you were faking the caregiving. He felt the cold, transactional nature of every cup of tea you poured and every pillow you fluffed. He saw you measuring the square footage of the mountain estate while he was still breathing. He watched you, cataloging his possessions, calculating the exact monetary value of a life he spent decades building." Sylvia began to shake. The tremor originated in her shoulders, traveling down her arms until her diamond necklace rattled softly against her collarbone. "You told everyone his mind was failing," I pressed on, my voice stripping away the final layers of her defense. "You convinced your friends, his colleagues, and even his doctors that dementia had stolen his cognitive reasoning. But his brain remained as sharp as a diamond-cutting blade. He played the fading patriarch because it was the only way to observe your true character when you thought the audience had left the theater. He orchestrated a brilliant silent test of loyalty, and you failed it in the most spectacular fashion imaginable." I paused, letting the profound weight of my father's judgment settle over her shoulders. "He did not lose his mind, Sylvia. He just lost his patience with you." The declaration hung in the quiet dining room, a permanent and unforgivable condemnation. Sylvia slumped backward in her heavy wooden chair, her spine curved, her poised socialite posture collapsing entirely. The mask was gone. The audience she had brought to validate her victory was now bearing witness to her utter humiliation. Constance and Victoria refused to look in her direction, staring intently at their own crystal water goblets, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The silence was abruptly shattered by a harsh, scraping noise. Preston could not tolerate this suffocating atmosphere. The illusion of his impending $30 million rescue was vaporizing before his very eyes. The fragile ego of the failed real estate developer cracked under the intense pressure. He reacted with predictable, brute force. He shoved his heavy chair backwards so violently it nearly tipped over. He sprang to his feet, his imposing frame looming over the dining table. His face had flushed a dark, angry crimson. A thick vein pulsed erratically near his left temple. He planted both of his hands flat against the mahogany wood, leaning his weight forward, trying to physically intimidate me by occupying a dominant higher altitude. "That piece of paper means nothing," Preston snarled, his voice rough and echoing harshly in the confined space. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger at the copy of the handwritten letter resting in front of his mother. He dismissed the heartfelt, strategic message with a venomous sneer. "It is just the rambling, incoherent nonsense of a dying old man," Preston shouted, abandoning any remaining pretense of upper-class civility. "That is a personal note. It is not a legally binding document. It holds zero weight in a court of law. You cannot march in here with a nostalgic piece of stationery and think you can dictate the terms of this inheritance." He shifted his gaze to the thick stack of legal paper he had presented earlier. He tapped the silver cap of the stolen Mont Blanc pen against the quitclaim deed, treating the fraudulent contract like a supreme, undeniable authority. "The official will filed with the state names my mother as the primary beneficiary," Preston declared, his chest heaving with exertion. "She inherits the mountain estate. She inherits the liquid assets. She inherits every single acre of that protected wilderness. You are just an estranged, bitter kid trying to cause trouble because your father forgot about you at the end." He slammed his open palm flat against the mahogany wood. The impact caused the silver flatware to rattle loudly against the fine china plates. "You have no power here," Nadia Preston yelled, his eyes wide and manic. "None. My mother holds the keys to the kingdom. You will sign this release tonight, or we will drag you through a decade of brutal litigation until you are entirely bankrupt." I remained seated, my posture relaxed, my hands resting calmly on my briefcase. I observed his frantic, aggressive outburst with the detached, clinical interest of an engineer watching a poorly constructed bridge sway in high winds. Preston had committed the classic fatal error of an arrogant adversary. Instead of retreating to assess the damage, he doubled down on a fabricated reality. He clung desperately to the temporary will a legal structure that had been dissolved and replaced months ago. He demanded my obedience based on an authority that no longer existed. His aggressive shouting only solidified the walls of the trap I had built. He believed the handwritten letter was my only weapon. He thought I was relying on sentimentality to fight a legal battle. He had absolutely no idea about the forensic evidence sitting silently inside my black presentation folder, waiting to elevate his greedy desperation into a federal felony. I let his shouting echo into the shadows of the room, preparing to drop the final floor out from under his feet. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I remained seated in my heavy mahogany chair, watching my stepbrother tower over the table with his chest heaving and his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. His raised voice echoed off the dark wood paneling, rattling the crystal goblets near his spilled ice water. He was trying to use physical intimidation to dominate the airspace in the room. It was the desperate tactic of a man who had run out of intellectual ammunition. I let his shouted threats hang in the stifling air of the private dining suite, waiting until the echo faded into a thick, suffocating quiet. "You are right, Preston," I said. My voice was calm, leveled, and entirely devoid of fear. The stark contrast between his frantic shouting and my composed resonance caused the remaining tension in the room to shift entirely in my favor. I looked at the copy of my father's handwritten message resting in front of my stepmother. The letter is not a legal document. It is just the emotional truth. It explains why he did what he did. It proves he saw through the facade. But you are correct in stating that it holds no binding weight in a probate court. Preston let out a harsh, triumphant breath. He adjusted his expensive tailored suit jacket, believing his outburst had successfully bullied me into submission. He shot a smug, validated glance toward his mother, silently claiming victory over the unruly stepdaughter. I unclasped the brass hinges of my leather briefcase. I reached inside and retrieved the matte black presentation folder I had so carefully assembled in my apartment. I laid it flat on the pristine white tablecloth. This, however, is a very different story, I stated. I opened the black cover. I bypassed the printed emails detailing their $30 million resort transaction. I reached for the rigid state-issued parchment bearing the official government seal. I pulled the environmental waiver out and slid it down the center of the table. The heavy paper glided smoothly over the linen, coming to a halt right next to the stolen silver Mont Blanc pen. I drew out the second piece of evidence. It was the side-by-side forensic analysis I had compiled, featuring the high-resolution scan of the signature on the waiver, juxtaposed against my father's original architectural blueprint. I pushed this document down the table to join the first. You needed a way to bypass the environmental conservation restrictions my father placed on the mountain estate, I explained, my tone adopting the precise instructional cadence of a professor delivering a lecture. The Vanguard Resort Group would never wire you the liquidation funds unless the pristine alpine meadows were legally rezoned for commercial excavation, and state property law requires the primary estate holder to authorize that specific release. I kept my eyes locked on Preston. His triumphant sneer faltered. He looked down at the documents resting near his hands. The color in his flushed cheeks began to drain, replaced by a sickly pale hue. My father was dead, I continued, enunciating every syllable with deliberate clarity. You could not ask him to sign the release, so you forged his signature and backdated the document to a week before his passing. It was a bold maneuver, Preston, but you made a fatal structural error. I stood up slowly, ensuring my posture was impeccably straight. I buttoned my charcoal blazer, projecting unyielding authority. My father spent 4 decades drafting blueprints on slanted tables, I said, pointing a steady finger toward the forensic analysis sheet. He used a physical T-square for every single project. That kind of repetitive, exact discipline permanently alters a person's muscle memory. His vertical lines were always perfectly perpendicular. He never wavered, he never slanted his strokes. The letter T in his first name was always a flawless 90-degree angle. I leaned forward slightly, resting my knuckles against the edge of the dining table. Now look at the signature on the waiver you intend to file with the state. The ink is heavy, the stroke leans, the vertical line slants several degrees to the right, and the ink pools slightly on the left side of the curve. That is the distinct, undeniable hallmark of a left-handed writer attempting to mimic a right-handed signature. You hold your pen with a hooked grip, Preston, your palm dragged across the bottom of the page. My father did not sign that environmental release. You did. The silence in the Elk Room became so dense, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the occupants. I shifted my gaze away from my stepbrother. I turned my attention directly to Constance and Victoria. The 2 high society socialites were sitting frozen in their upholstered chairs, their eyes wide with dawning horror. I needed them to understand the exact nature of the crime they were currently witnessing. Under Colorado law, I said, addressing the 2 women with polite but firm intensity, forging a signature on a standard personal check is a minor offense. But forging an environmental release document to strip a protected land trust of its federal conservation status is not a simple family squabble. It is a highly regulated, thoroughly prosecuted federal offense. I watched the realization wash over Constance's face. She swallowed hard, her manicured hand dropping away from her pearl necklace. When you combine that forgery with an attempt to execute a $30 million commercial real estate transaction across state lines, I explained, turning my focus back to my stepmother, it triggers a cascade of severe charges: wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, grand larceny. If you are listening to this story and enjoying the methodical dismantling of these manipulators, take a moment to follow the channel Morning Revenge, because the trap is about to snap fully shut. Preston could no longer maintain his dominant posture. The adrenaline that had fueled his aggressive outburst evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, hollow terror. His knees buckled. He collapsed backward into his heavy mahogany chair. The impact rattled the silverware on the table. His arms hung limply at his sides. The arrogance was entirely wiped from his face, replaced by the vacant, glassy stare of a man who had just realized his entire future was evaporating before his eyes. He looked down at his own left hand, staring at his fingers as if they had betrayed him. Sylvia was unraveling at an even faster pace. The poised, elegant widow persona shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She began to hyperventilate. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks. She clutched the edge of the table, her diamond necklace rising and falling erratically. "You cannot prove anything," Sylvia whispered. Her voice was weak, reedy, and laced with desperation. Her eyes darted around the room, pleading for someone to intervene, but her wealthy friends remained stone still, actively distancing themselves from the sinking ship. "You are making wild accusations. It is just your word against ours. The courts will never believe you." I tapped the surface of my matte black folder. "I do not have to prove it, Sylvia," I replied, my voice chillingly serene. "The state investigators will. They possess entire forensic divisions dedicated to analyzing ink density, paper indentations, and digital footprints. Once they subpoena Preston's emails with the Vanguard Resort Group, they will find the exact timeline of your conspiracy." I walked slowly around the edge of the table, closing the physical distance between us. "But the most damning piece of evidence is the timeline you constructed yourself," I stated, stopping just a few feet away from her chair. "You banned me from the funeral today. You explicitly told the funeral director to deny me entry. You orchestrated my absence to guarantee you had a clean 48-hour window to file this fraudulent deed with the probate court by default." I let the weight of that truth settle over the room. "That tactical decision was your undoing," I whispered, ensuring every person at the table heard the finality in my tone. "Banning me from the burial proves you did not forge this document in a moment of sudden panic. It establishes clear, undeniable premeditation. You planned this crime days in advance. You locked the doors of your own prison." The architectural dismantling was complete. I had not raised my voice. I had not thrown a single insult. I had simply used the foundation of their own greed to trap them in an inescapable corner. They were caught holding the stolen pen, sitting in front of the forged contract, surrounded by witnesses who would never risk their own reputations to defend a federal crime. The timing was a masterstroke of architectural precision. I had sent a discreet text message from my smartwatch under the table right before I initiated the final confrontation. Just as the crushing reality of the forgery accusation settled over my stepmother and stepbrother, the heavy mahogany doors of the Elk Room swung open. The brass hinges groaned softly in the quiet dining suite, drawing every eye toward the entrance. David Reed crossed the threshold. The veteran attorney wore a tailored wool trench coat, bringing the frigid, biting winter chill of the Denver evening directly into the stifling heat of the private room. He moved with the undeniable purpose of a man executing a flawless legal maneuver. Tucked securely under his left arm was a formidable, thick leather-bound binder. The ambient noise from the busy restaurant corridor seeped in for a brief second before the heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing the room once again. David ignored the terrified, wide-eyed stares of the two high society socialites. He paid no attention to Preston, who remained slumped in his chair staring blankly at his own trembling hands. The lawyer walked the length of the thick carpet, his dress shoes making no sound, until he stopped directly behind Sylvia. "Good evening, Sylvia," David said. His tone lacked any trace of traditional legal courtesy. It was devoid of warmth, ringing out like a heavy gavel striking a wooden block. "Nadia is correct in her assessment of the situation," he continued, looking down at the pale, shaking woman. He stepped forward and dropped the heavy binder directly onto the center of the crisp white tablecloth. The thick leather cover struck the mahogany table with a profound, resonating thud. The impact caused the silverware to clatter against the fine china plates, a sharp metallic sound that made Constance and Victoria jump in their seats. "I am here in my official capacity as the primary legal counsel for the Westbrook family," David stated, his voice echoing against the dark wood paneling. "I am here to formally execute the Thomas Westbrook Irrevocable Land Trust." Sylvia stared at the gold-embossed lettering stamped across the dark leather cover. Her eyes darted wildly, her brain struggling to process the unfamiliar terminology. "A trust," she stammered, her voice cracking into a high, reedy pitch. "There is no trust. Thomas left a standard will. He filed it with the state a decade ago. I am his surviving spouse. I inherit the estate by default. David unfastened the sturdy brass clasp securing the binder. He flipped open the heavy cover, smoothing the crisp first page flat against the table for her to read. Thomas dissolved that standard will 3 months ago, David explained. His delivery was clinical, unyielding, and surgically precise. He recognized the profound danger you posed to his life's work. He bypassed the public probate courts entirely to ensure you could never leverage a spousal override. David pointed his pristine index finger at the bold heading of the legal document. He transferred the 500-acre property of all liquid assets and every remaining financial holding into a blind trust. David continued, "An irrevocable structure cannot be altered, contested, or touched by a disgruntled widow. It is a financial fortress. Your 48-hour window to claim abandonment was useless before the funeral even began." David shifted his gaze to meet Sylvia's terrified eyes. "Nadia is the sole appointed trustee," the lawyer declared. "She is the exclusive beneficiary of the entire empire. You inherited nothing, Sylvia. Not the land, not the bank accounts, not a single cent." The revelation struck the room with devastating force. Sylvia's lungs seemed to seize. She gasped for air, her chest heaving under her velvet dress. The fraudulent quitclaim deed sitting on the table, the $50,000 check Preston had so arrogantly written, the backdated environmental waiver, they were all instantly rendered entirely worthless. They had spent months plotting to steal an empire that had already been quietly moved out of their reach. A low, guttural groan escaped Preston's throat. The sound was pathetic, the noise of a defeated man realizing the full scope of his own ruin. He buried his face in his hands, digging his fingers into his scalp. The lucrative resort deal with Vanguard was dead. The offshore wire transfers would never arrive. His angry creditors would soon strip him of his remaining assets. Worst of all, he had forged a federal environmental document to sell a property his mother never owned in the first place. He had committed a severe felony for zero financial gain. He was broke, and he was heading to federal prison. The poised, elegant facade Sylvia had maintained for a decade finally shattered. The sophisticated widow persona evaporated, exposing the raw, greedy core underneath. She erupted into genuine, visceral tears. It was not a delicate, performative weeping. It was an ugly, distorted sobbing that twisted her facial features into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "I gave him 10 years of my life," Sylvia screamed. Her voice grew shrill, tearing through her vocal cords. She slammed her manicured fists against the pristine tablecloth, knocking over her crystal water goblet. The liquid pooled around the leather binder, but David calmly pulled the documents out of the way, protecting the true legacy from her chaotic mess. "I froze in that miserable, isolated cabin," Sylvia wailed, unleashing a decade of hidden resentment. "I endured the dirt tracked across my rugs. I suffered through the quiet nights and his endless boring lectures about protecting trees and rivers. I sacrificed my prime years living in the middle of nowhere for that man. I earned that estate. It belongs to me." Constance and Victoria watched the breakdown with undisguised horror. Sylvia had just confessed to hating the very life she pretended to cherish. She validated everything my father suspected. The socialites exchanged a single decisive glance. They recognized a sinking ship. They simultaneously picked up their expensive silk purses and stood from their upholstered chairs. They did not offer a single word of comfort. They walked swiftly toward the exit door, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout, leaving their former friend isolated in her own disgrace. I watched the two women leave, listening to the heavy door click shut behind them. Then I stood up from my chair at the foot of the table. I buttoned the front of my tailored charcoal blazer. I aligned the fabric, projecting perfect structural integrity. I looked down the length of the mahogany table at the weeping, shattered woman sitting in the shadows of her own failed scheme. "You gave him an act, Sylvia," I said. My voice was soft, yet it carried an icy resonance that commanded the empty spaces of the room. "You played a role and you expected a lucrative payout at the final curtain." I continued, my eyes locked on her tear-stained face. "But my father was the architect of this foundation, and he saw right through your performance, and you got paid exactly what your loyalty was worth. Zero." The public humiliation was total. The reversal was profound and undeniable. Sylvia and Preston were left sitting in a silent dining room, staring at forged documents, stripped of their wealth, abandoned by their peers, and waiting for the authorities to arrive. The trap had snapped shut, and the foundation I built held firm. The legal fallout following the disastrous dinner at the Alpine Club was not a loud, drawn-out courtroom spectacle. It was a swift, quiet, and utterly ruthless dismantling of two incredibly arrogant manipulators. The very next morning, Sylvia and Preston scrambled to hire a team of elite defense attorneys, draining the last of their available credit limits to secure high-powered legal representation. But criminal defense lawyers are highly pragmatic creatures who operate strictly on verifiable facts. When David Reed sat across from them and presented the backdated environmental waiver, the printed email chains to the Vanguard Resort Group, and the side-by-side forensic analysis of the slanted signature, their high-priced attorneys took exactly one look at the undeniable evidence and realized the battle was already entirely lost. The paper trail was absolute. There was absolutely no plausible deniability left to hide behind. The attorney sat Sylvia and Preston down in a sterile, windowless conference room and delivered a crushing, non-negotiable ultimatum. If this case went to a federal trial, the prosecution would easily secure convictions for wire fraud, severe identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. Preston would face up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Sylvia, as the primary financial beneficiary of the orchestrated fraud, would serve a lengthy sentence right alongside him. David offered them a single, highly conditional exit strategy. I would agree to withhold the forged documents from the federal prosecutor. In exchange, Sylvia and Preston had to formally surrender the fake waiver, waive any and all future rights to contest the irrevocable land trust, and immediately vacate the state of Colorado. They had exactly 24 hours to pack their personal belongings and vanish. The capitulation was instantaneous. Stripped of their leverage and terrified of facing severe prison time, they signed the surrender agreements in total defeated silence. The resulting financial ruin was catastrophic. Preston was left entirely bankrupt. Without the anticipated $30 million payout from the commercial resort developers, his angry creditors descended upon him like a pack of starving wolves. They seized his leased luxury cars in the middle of the night, they liquidated his remaining urban assets, froze his checking accounts, and left him with nothing but insurmountable, crushing debt. He was forced to flee the city with a ruined credit score and a shattered ego. Sylvia suffered a different, far more personal kind of ruin. Constance and Victoria had already spread the story of her profound humiliation through the elite whisper networks of downtown Denver. Her prestigious country club memberships were quietly but firmly revoked. Her high society luncheon invitations evaporated into thin air. She was instantly transformed into a social pariah, banished from the wealthy, insulated circles she had spent 10 grueling years cultivating. The mother and son packed a rented moving truck under the cover of darkness and drove away, disappearing into permanent obscurity. With the parasites successfully removed from the ecosystem, a profound, enduring peace settled over the majestic mountain estate. I did not simply move into the beautiful timber and stone house to live a quiet, secluded life. I applied my rigorous skills as a historic preservation architect to the surrounding wilderness itself. I treated the 500 acres of pristine alpine meadows, ancient pine forests, and winding glacial streams as the ultimate grand-scale restoration project. I worked tirelessly alongside David Reed and various state environmental authorities to draft a permanent, unbreakable conservation easement. We filed the heavy stacks of legal paperwork with the county clerk, ensuring the sprawling land could never be commercially zoned, excavated, or sold to corporate resort developers. I formally designated the vast property as the Thomas Westbrook State Wildlife Sanctuary. The newly protected sanctuary would serve as a permanent refuge for the migrating elk herds, the nesting bald eagles, and the fragile alpine flora my father had spent his entire adult life fiercely defending against corporate encroachment. The towering evergreen pines would remain standing tall against the horizon. The granite ridges would remain untouched by explosive dynamite or suffocating concrete. I had successfully secured the perimeter, reinforced the load-bearing pillars of the financial trust, and guaranteed that his righteous legacy would outlast all of us. 6 months after the quiet legal surrender, the brutal winter finally broke, giving way to the crisp, vibrant awakening of a beautiful Colorado spring. I woke up early one morning, just as the bright sun began to breach the jagged eastern horizon. I walked into the familiar kitchen, breathing in the comforting scent of oiled cedar and fresh mountain air. I pulled a sealed bag of dark roast coffee beans from the wooden cabinet and fed them into the mechanical grinder. I brewed the coffee incredibly strong, black and bitter, exactly the way my father always preferred to drink it. I poured the steaming dark liquid into a thick ceramic mug and pushed open the heavy glass double doors leading out to the sprawling wooden deck. The sharp, freezing alpine air filled my lungs, acting as an exhilarating sensory shock to my system. I walked to the edge of the sturdy timber railing and looked out over the vast, untamed expanse of the sanctuary. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the background, appearing immovable, eternal, and breathtakingly majestic. The early morning light cast a brilliant, warm golden glow over the jagged granite peaks, illuminating the deep, vibrant green valleys situated far below. The world was utterly silent, save for the distant rushing sound of the glacial river cutting a path through the ancient bedrock. I set my heavy ceramic mug down on the smooth wooden railing. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my thick wool cardigan and pulled out the folded sheet of heavy stock parchment. The crimson wax seal remained broken along the edge, but the architectural block lettering was just as sharp and deliberate as the day it was originally written. I bypassed the opening lines concerning the deception and the strategic instructions for the legal ambush. I scrolled my eyes down to the very bottom of the page, focusing entirely on the final, resonating command my father had left for me. Build something that lasts, Nadia. I folded the parchment gently and tucked it safely back into my pocket, keeping the words close to my heart. I wrapped my cold hands around the warm ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee. I looked back up at the towering mountains dominating the skyline. I was no longer the weeping, excluded daughter standing on a distant city balcony, grieving a stolen goodbye in total isolation. I was the legally appointed guardian of the mountain. I was the architect who had successfully navigated the storm, diagnosed the catastrophic structural failures of my enemies, and executed a flawless surgical demolition of their unchecked greed. My stepmother and stepbrother had desperately tried to build their wealthy future on a weak foundation of shifting gravel and fraudulent lies, and they had been effortlessly swept away by the very first heavy wind. I had anchored my stance on solid granite, trusting the enduring, unshakable authenticity of the truth. A deep, profound sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. The legacy was safe. The wilderness was protected. The foundation had held. If you enjoyed seeing greed shatter against a rock-solid truth, do not forget to follow Morning Revenge. Drop a comment below on how you would have handled Sylvia, and we will see you in the next story. A foundation is only as strong as the stone upon which it sits. We hear this in architecture, but it is a truth that reverberates far beyond blueprints and concrete. When we reflect on the story of Nadia Westbrook, a daughter who stood in the quiet dignity of the Rocky Mountains, while her step-family's empire of lies crumbled at her feet, we are not merely looking at a tale of a stolen inheritance reclaimed. We are looking at a profound parable about American family dynamics, the true nature of legacy, and the moral architecture we construct within our own homes. In modern American culture, there is an overwhelming, almost frantic obsession with what we leave behind for our children. We equate good parenting with upward mobility. We exhaust ourselves to leave behind paid-off mortgages, robust college funds, and padded stock portfolios. Yet in our pursuit of securing their material future, we often neglect the traditional foundational mandate of character. Thomas Westbrook did not just leave his daughter a 500-acre alpine estate. He left her the emotional and moral fortitude required to defend it. The most urgent message this story conveys to parents across America is that traditional family education must be rooted in unyielding honesty, fairness, and deep emotional awareness. Parenting is not about shielding your children from the harsh realities of human nature. It is about teaching them how to navigate those realities without losing their own integrity. Thomas recognized the rot within his own household. Rather than playing the blissful, ignorant patriarch to keep the peace, he confronted the truth of his wife and stepson's greed. He taught Nadia that love is not synonymous with blind trust. By modeling resilience and quiet observation, he gave her the tools to survive the storm when he was no longer there to shield her from the wind. To raise a child with traditional values is to raise them with eyes wide open, instilling a moral compass that points true north even when the rest of the world is spinning in chaos. From the perspective of Nadia herself, the message imparted to today's young people is equally vital. Emotional regulation is the ultimate superpower. We live in a society that constantly encourages performative outrage and immediate visceral reactions. Social media and modern culture urge young people to broadcast their pain, to scream at injustice, and to weaponize their trauma. Nadia chose a different path. When faced with the ultimate betrayal, being banned from her own father's funeral and offered pennies for her birthright, she did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum. She retreated into her competence. She teaches young people that true power does not roar. It observes, it calculates, and it waits. By mastering her emotions, she turned her stepfamily's arrogance into their very own prison. She demonstrates that the most devastating response to cruelty is a well-documented truth delivered with absolute, unwavering calm. If we elevate our gaze and examine this narrative through the lens of a spiritual practitioner, observing the current state of American society, the story takes on a deeply existential dimension. We are living in an era heavily intoxicated by the illusion of materialism. Sylvia and Preston are tragic avatars of this modern sickness. They chased the hollow metrics of success, designer labels, country club memberships, and offshore bank accounts, sacrificing their own humanity on the altar of status. They believed that manipulating the physical world could shield them from spiritual bankruptcy. The path of self-cultivation demands the exact opposite. True spiritual resilience is built by developing inner wisdom and unwavering morality. A practitioner looks at Sylvia's frantic weeping in that private dining room and sees the inevitable suffering that comes from attaching one's soul to impermanent things. Self-cultivation is the daily practice of aligning oneself with truth, recognizing that any life built on a foundation of deceit will eventually collapse under the weight of its own karma. The spiritual message to American parents is clear. Guide your children toward the internal rather than the external. Teach them that peace is not found in the accumulation of wealth, but in the quiet, unshakable knowledge of one's own integrity. When you cultivate a child's soul, you give them an inheritance that no forged document, no economic downturn, and no manipulative adversary can ever steal. If this reflection on truth, resilience, and the quiet triumphs of the human spirit resonates with your own journey, I encourage you to follow Morning Revenge. It is a space where we continue to explore these deep, transformative narratives, reminding ourselves that the light always eventually pierces the shadows. We are often told that family is everything. Conventional wisdom dictates that blood is thicker than water, that loyalty to one's household is the highest virtue, and that we must always forgive the trespasses of our kin for the sake of unity. But there is a deeper, much harsher truth that goes against this comfortable cultural grain. Sometimes the most profound act of love is a closed door. Loyalty without morality is not loyalty, it is simply complicity. We are not obligated to set ourselves on fire simply to keep toxic relatives warm. True family responsibility does not mean absorbing the abuse of those who share our dinner table. It means having the profound courage to sever the rotting branches of the family tree so that the roots might actually survive. In the end, the ultimate lesson of the mountain is this: you cannot protect your children from the cruelty of the world, nor can you always protect them from the cruelty within their own bloodline. The only true legacy you can leave them is the strength of their own spine. Build the stone, ignore the weather, and trust that when the storms of deception finally pass, the truth will be the only thing left standing.